The iron chains around Bjorn's wrists had worn through to the bone after 3 years of dragging dead whales up Norway's frozen beaches. His hands looked like raw meat wrapped around white sticks, but the whale oil master needed him alive for one more season. At 19, Bjorn weighed 67 pounds and hadn't spoken in 8 months because his throat was burned shut from breathing whale fat smoke 12 hours a day. His job was to crawl inside rotting whale carcasses and scrape out every drop of oil, while the methane gas made him hallucinate his dead mother calling his name. When winter came, they would chain him inside the whale processing pit to keep him from running away, where he would spend 4 months breathing nothing but the smell of decomposing whale flesh mixed with his own waste. Everyone knows Vikings as fearless warriors who sailed across oceans to raid and conquer. History books show them with gleaming swords and magnificent ships, striking terror into the hearts of their enemies. But for every legendary Viking warrior, there were 50 others trapped in jobs so horrific that death would have been a mercy. These weren't the Vikings who got songs written about them. These were the ones who disappeared into work so dangerous and disgusting that even other Vikings pretended they didn't exist. It was built on a foundation of human suffering so extreme that the lucky ones died quickly in battle. Children as young as 12 were sold into whale oil extraction because their small frames could crawl deep inside whale intestines to scrape out every valuable drop. They called these children gut crawlers, and most of them died within 2 years from methane poisoning or being crushed when whale carcasses shifted unexpectedly. The survivors developed a condition where their skin turned permanently yellow from absorbing whale toxins, and they smelled so bad that even their own families wouldn't let them inside their homes. A single whale could produce enough oil to light an entire Viking settlement for 3 months, but extracting that oil required gut crawlers to spend up to 16 hours inside a decomposing carcass. The methane gas inside dead whales was so concentrated that it would cause immediate hallucinations, but the children had to keep working through visions of their dead relatives and imaginary monsters attacking them. Many gut crawlers would emerge from whale carcasses speaking to people who weren't there, convinced that the dead whales were still alive and talking to them. The rising water would cause the whale carcass to shift and compress, crushing anyone still inside. Rescue attempts were impossible because the methane gas would kill adult rescuers within minutes. Families would have to listen to their children screaming from inside the whale while being unable to help them. The screaming usually lasted about 4 hours before the children either suffocated or were crushed to death. The whale oil masters discovered that children who survived the first year developed an immunity to the toxic gases, making them incredibly valuable. These surviving gut crawlers were worth more than 3 adult slaves, so their owners would cut the tendons in their legs to prevent escape attempts. They spent their entire lives crawling through rotting whale flesh, unable to walk, unable to run, unable to die. These men had to slice through a living person's back, break their ribs one by one, and pull out their lungs while keeping the victim conscious for as long as possible. The carvers inhaled so much blood spray that most developed lung infections within months. Their hands became permanently stained red because human blood contains iron that bonds with skin tissue. After 5 executions, most Blood Eagle carvers started having nightmares so violent they would attack their own families in their sleep. Blood Eagle executions had to follow exact procedures to satisfy the gods, which meant carvers couldn't rush through the process even when victims were screaming in agony. The ribs had to be broken in a specific sequence, starting from the bottom and working upward, with each break requiring precisely 3 hammer strikes. The victim's lungs had to be pulled out while still attached to create the eagle wings effect, but this required keeping the person alive through massive blood loss and organ trauma. Carvers who made mistakes were forced to start over with a fresh victim while the botched execution was left to suffer until they died naturally. Trainees practiced on pigs first, then on condemned criminals who were already scheduled to die. The psychological screening process eliminated anyone who showed signs of empathy or hesitation, leaving only candidates who demonstrated an ability to ignore human suffering completely. Most successful carvers had already killed their own family members or close friends before being accepted for training. But staying sober meant experiencing every detail of slowly torturing someone to death. Many carvers tried to drink before executions and were immediately killed by their own community for showing disrespect to the gods. The job created men who were simultaneously essential to Viking justice and completely insane from trauma. They lived alone, died alone, and were buried in unmarked graves because even in death, No one wanted to be associated with their work. Mining bog iron meant spending entire days chest deep in freezing swamp water, digging through layers of rotting vegetation and animal waste to find tiny deposits of iron ore. Bog iron miners developed a condition called swamp lung, where their lungs filled with methane gas and organic matter, causing them to cough up black sludge for the rest of their lives. The work required miners to hold their breath underwater for up to 3 minutes at a time while digging through marsh muck that contained centuries of decomposed animals. The bog iron deposits were so small that miners had to sift through approximately 2,000 pounds of marsh muck to find 1 pound of usable iron ore. This meant that a single day's work required processing enough toxic swamp material to fill a small building, all while standing in freezing water that caused hypothermia within hours. Miners developed a technique called marsh breathing, where they would deliberately hyperventilate before going underwater to extend their breath-holding time, but this often led to blackouts that would cause them to drown in the swamp while unconscious. The bog water contained bacteria that had been feeding on decomposed organic matter for hundreds of years, creating infections that modern medicine would classify as impossible to survive. Miners who got cut while working would develop gangrene within 6 hours, and the only treatment was immediate amputation performed with the same iron tools they used for mining. Most bog iron miners were missing at least 3 fingers by their second year on the job, but they continued working because Viking society provided no support for disabled people. The bog water was so toxic that open cuts would become infected within hours, leading to gangrene that spread faster than it could be amputated. Most bog iron miners lost fingers, toes, or entire hands to infection, but they kept working because Viking society offered no support for disabled people. They lived in huts built directly over the swamps where they worked, surrounded by the constant smell of methane and rotting organic matter. Their average lifespan was 26 years, and most died when their lungs finally filled completely with swamp debris. Berserkers consumed a mixture of mushrooms, fermented fish oil, and human blood before battle to achieve their legendary fighting frenzy. But what history doesn't mention is that berserker drug preparation was a full-time job, performed by specialized feeders who had to test every batch on themselves to ensure proper potency. These feeders spent their days in a constant state of partial overdose, experiencing hallucinations, violent seizures, and periods where they couldn't distinguish between reality and nightmare. The berserker drug mixture had to be prepared fresh daily because the mushroom component would become toxic within 12 hours of preparation. Feeders had to wake up at 3 in the morning to begin the preparation process, which required them to consume small amounts of each ingredient to test for proper fermentation and potency. By sunrise, most feeders were already experiencing mild hallucinations and muscle tremors from their testing doses, but they still had to complete the full preparation process while their minds were compromised by the drugs they had consumed. The mushroom component came from a specific variety that grew only on human graves and had to be harvested during full moons to maintain potency. Feeders spent entire nights crawling through graveyards, scraping mushrooms off of decomposed corpses, while experiencing drug-induced visions that made them believe the dead were trying to communicate with them. Many feeders developed a condition where they could only sleep in graveyards, because they felt safer surrounded by what they believed were friendly spirits, who understood their suffering. The berserker feeding process required feeders to consume fresh human blood daily to build up tolerance for the blood component of the battle drug. They had to drink blood from different types of people, warriors, children, elderly people, because each type affected the drug differently. Feeders developed a condition where their bodies couldn't process regular food anymore, and they could only survive by consuming blood and the fermented fish oil mixture. Most feeders died within 3 years from organ failure caused by constant drug toxicity, but not before their minds completely deteriorated from chronic hallucinations. Funeral pyre tenders had to ensure that Viking funeral fires burned hot enough and long enough to completely consume human bodies, which required maintaining temperatures above 1,800 degrees for several hours. The heat was so intense that tenders had to work in shifts of 15 minutes before the radiant heat would literally cook their internal organs. Most tenders suffered from constant burns that never fully healed, and their lungs filled with ash and bone dust that caused them to suffocate slowly over several years. The fuel requirements for proper cremation were enormous, requiring tenders to maintain fires that consumed over 3 tons of wood per body. This meant constantly feeding the flames while standing close enough to the fire that their clothing would catch fire regularly. Tenders developed a technique of soaking their clothes in water before each shift, but the water would turn to steam within minutes, creating burns from superheated vapor that were often worse than direct flame contact. Different types of bodies required different burning techniques, and tenders had to adjust their methods based on the deceased person's age, size, and physical condition. Children's bodies burned too quickly and would be consumed before the ceremonial requirements were met, so tenders had to use special techniques to slow the burning process while ensuring complete cremation. Obese bodies would cause dangerous flare-ups when their fat ignited, creating fireballs that could kill anyone within 50 feet of the pyre. Tenders had to use iron tools to break apart bones and reposition body parts to ensure complete cremation, often while family members watched and demanded that their loved one's body be treated with respect. The bone dust and human fat smoke created a coating inside the tender's lungs that turned solid over time, essentially creating cement inside their respiratory system. They died by drowning in their own hardened lung tissue. Human sacrifice attendants prepared victims for ritual killing by drugging them, cleaning them, and positioning them for whatever method of death the gods demanded that day. The drugs used to keep victims calm were so potent that attendants absorbed them through skin contact, leading to chronic addiction and brain damage. Most attendants developed tremors, memory loss, and periods of complete blackouts where they would perform their duties with no conscious awareness of their actions. The psychological trauma of preparing dozens of people for death created attendants who could no longer form emotional connections with other humans. They stopped feeling empathy, stopped experiencing normal emotions, and eventually stopped being able to sleep without having nightmares about the people they had helped kill. Many attendants tried to commit suicide, but Viking law required them to stay alive to serve the gods. Guards were assigned to watch attendants constantly to prevent them from escaping through death. Scouts had to survive alone in the wilderness for weeks at a time with minimal supplies, often eating tree bark and their own leather equipment to avoid starvation. Most scouts lost toes, fingers, or entire hands to frostbite, but they couldn't return to their armies until they had completed their missions. Scouts carried enough food for only 3 days, and were expected to survive by hunting, foraging, and eating anything they could find, including leather from their own clothing and equipment. When regular food sources were unavailable, scouts would eat bark from specific trees, their own fingernails, and in extreme cases, flesh from their own frost-bitten appendages that had already died from cold exposure. The psychological effects of extreme isolation combined with constant physical suffering created scouts who returned from missions unable to interact normally with other humans. Many scouts would attack anyone who approached them without warning, having developed survival instincts so strong that they couldn't distinguish between allies and enemies. The military command expected this behavior and would keep returned scouts isolated for several weeks to allow them to readjust to human contact before using them for additional missions. The isolation and extreme cold caused many winter scouts to develop a condition called ice madness, where they would start talking to imaginary companions and making decisions based on hallucinations caused by prolonged exposure to freezing temperatures. Scouts who returned alive often couldn't readjust to normal social interaction, and would attack anyone who tried to touch them or speak to them unexpectedly. Viking armies used winter scouts as expendable resources, expecting them to die during their missions and replacing them with new scouts who didn't know what the job actually required. Rune carvers who specialized in curse tablets had to carve symbols into human bones, while the bones were still fresh and bloody to ensure the curses would work properly. The bone dust created by carving fresh human bones contained blood and marrow that would get under the carver's fingernails and into small cuts on their hands, leading to constant infections that never fully healed. Curse carvers developed a distinctive smell from the infected bone dust embedded in their skin, and most people could identify them from 50 feet away. They believed that any mistake in carving could redirect the curse back onto themselves, so they worked in a state of permanent anxiety that often led to hand tremors and mistakes that they believed would kill them. Many curse carvers died from heart attacks brought on by the stress of believing their own mistakes had cursed them to death. The few who survived long enough to retire from the job spent their remaining years in isolation, convinced that they carried dozens of misdirected curses in their bodies. Ship ballast managers supervised human ballast during ocean voyages, which meant keeping slaves alive in the bottom of ships while using their bodies as weight to stabilize the vessel during storms. The ship's hold where human ballast was stored had no ventilation, no light, and no sanitation facilities. Ballast managers had to spend their days in this environment, breathing air so toxic that most developed lung infections within weeks of starting the job. The human ballast had to be arranged in specific patterns to properly distribute weight throughout the ship, which required managers to physically move unconscious or dying people into precise positions multiple times per day. During rough seas, the ballast would shift constantly, requiring managers to work around the clock repositioning bodies while the ship pitched and rolled violently. The managers themselves were chained to the walls to prevent them from being crushed by shifting ballast. But this meant they couldn't escape when ballast died and began decomposing around them. Long ocean voyages lasting several months created situations where managers had to remove dead ballast and replace them with surviving ones to maintain proper ship balance. The dead bodies couldn't be thrown overboard because the weight was needed for stability, so managers had to live surrounded by decomposing corpses for weeks at a time. The smell became so overwhelming that managers would lose their sense of smell permanently, and many developed infections in their nasal passages that would spread to their brains and kill them months after completing their voyage. When storms hit, ballast managers had to chain human ballast to prevent them from shifting and destabilizing the ship. This meant listening to dozens of people scream in terror and pain while being unable to help them or escape the situation themselves. Many ballast managers developed hearing damage from the constant screaming, and most completely lost their ability to sleep normally because they associated darkness and confined spaces with the traumatic memories of managing human ballast during storms. Leather preparation specialists who worked with human skin for ceremonial purposes had to remove skin from corpses while the bodies were still warm, to ensure the leather would be soft enough for ritual use. The process required specialists to work quickly before rigor mortis set in, often while family members of the deceased watched to ensure their loved one's skin was treated properly. The psychological trauma of skinning people while their families watched created specialists who developed multiple personality disorders as a way of coping with their work. The chemicals used to treat human skin for leather contained urine, animal brains, and fermented plant matter that created toxic fumes when mixed together. Skin specialists had to breathe these fumes for hours at a time while working, leading to brain damage that caused permanent memory loss and difficulty forming coherent thoughts. Most specialists could only communicate through gestures and simple words after working with human skin preparation for more than 2 years. Warriors who died in combat became legends, but the people who performed these essential jobs were erased from history because acknowledging their suffering would have undermined the entire system that created Viking prosperity. Every piece of iron, every drop of whale oil, every funeral pyre, every military victory was built on a foundation of human misery so complete that death became something people prayed for rather than feared. They were permanent positions that Viking society required to function, filled by people who had no choice but to accept them or starve. The Vikings created a civilization where the worst possible human experiences became daily work requirements, and the people who performed this work were simultaneously essential to society and completely expendable. The most horrific aspect of these jobs wasn't just the physical suffering they caused, but the way Viking society structured them to continue indefinitely. Each job was designed to trap people in cycles of suffering that made escape impossible, while ensuring that someone would always be available to perform work that was necessary for Viking civilization to continue. The whale oil industry, the mining operations, the ceremonial preparations, the military support systems. All of them functioned by converting human beings into disposable resources whose suffering was measured in terms of economic output rather than human cost. Understanding these jobs reveals the true foundation of Viking culture. It wasn't built on courage and honor, but on a systematic willingness to sacrifice human dignity for practical advantage. The Vikings who became legends were able to achieve their greatness because other Vikings were trapped in situations so desperate that they would accept any work, no matter how destructive, rather than face starvation or social exile. This is the hidden history that explains how Viking society was able to support its famous warriors and explorers. For every Viking who sailed to new lands or died gloriously in battle, there were dozens of others whose lives were consumed by work so terrible that their suffering was treated as a normal part of daily life. They built the weapons, extracted the resources, performed the ceremonies, and provided the support systems that made Viking conquest possible. And in return, they received jobs that were specifically designed to destroy them as completely as possible while keeping them alive long enough to continue working. It's also about a society that created systematic human suffering on a scale that most people today couldn't imagine. then erase that suffering from historical records to preserve an image of heroic warriors and noble explorers. These jobs existed. The people who performed them suffered and died in ways that defy comprehension, and their stories were deliberately forgotten because remembering them would have made it impossible to celebrate Viking achievements without acknowledging the human cost that made those achievements possible.